This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek, and one of the struggles taking place has been in France with the Yellow Vests, and there's a fight there as well against privatization of railways and public services. And joining us is
Axel Persson from the CGT unions and the railway workers of Trappes, which is a city in the southwestern suburbs of Paris, and I'm a locomotive engineer.
the issue of privatization. In the United States, public services are being privatized. In France, you have a great rail system, which is also under threat. Why is your union taking up this issue, and what does it mean for railroad workers in France as far as their economic conditions and their social conditions?
The government and also the the big corporations are now actually intent on implementing an agenda that aims to privatize the railway, but not only the railway, in general, all public services. And the reason for that is that they are trying to find new markets in which they can basically expand and garner more profits, even more profits than they are actually doing. So now they're setting up this economical model where they're saying they want to privatize the railway, but what they're in fact going to do, to be very specific, is to make sure that the railway, given the very heavy amount of investments that are needed to make it basically sustainable, it will still be funded by public taxpayers' money, but the operators who will operate the railway will be private and will be subsidized as well. But the public subsidies will be directed to private operators. So it's basically a situation where what is deemed not profitable enough will be financed by the taxpayers, but the benefits that can be potentially reaped from it will be directed to private investors and private shareholders. And the consequences for railway workers will of course be worse in terms and condition, because they are saying in order to make it even more profitable than it is today, we're going to have to cut down jobs, scale back unprofitable services, raise also passenger fares, and have an all-out offensive on our terms and conditions, on our pensions, and also everything we've basically won for the past decades as workers and organized labor.
And you've had some experience with the RMT, the Railway Workers Union in Britain. They also privatized. What happened after their privatization of the rails?
What happened, and it's very interesting that you mention it, because only 2 weeks ago we had a delegation of British railway workers from the RMT and also from Sweden, from the SECO trade union, who visited our workplaces and met rank and file workers to explain firsthand the consequences of privatization, which are the first and most immediate one is that the investments, the long-term investments for the maintenance of the network were no longer being made by these private investors, because they deemed it not profitable enough. They just wanted the short-term profits, which has led to massive defaults, massive failures, and accidents. And the British railway workers are currently alerting the general public that there is a multiplication of serious failures all across the network, including derailments, including track breaks, tracks that are literally collapsing because of lack of maintenance, which will lead to a catastrophe. And they are saying that now is not only we're no longer asking the question, will there be a catastrophe? It's just a matter of time before it happens. And the other consequence, of course, is that the terms and conditions of the railway workers since privatizations have been have been basically shoved down the gutter, basically. But that doesn't mean that they have stood idly by. They have also led massive strikes. They are leading currently a campaign for the bringing back the rail into public ownership, and they are also organizing massive series of strikes, despite draconian anti-strike laws that are in place, but that have managed to defeat in order to force the train operating companies and the company that manages the network to force through real-term wage increases. And also they have managed to successfully defend the jobs, for example, at the station offices that they plan to close down. So they have also shared experiences of successful struggles, and that is also something that we are inspiring ourselves from.
And how are the French workers, and particularly railway workers, organized in a way that you can fight to defend yourself? Because bureaucratization, corporatization of unions, business unions make it very difficult for workers to organize political campaigns. In fact, there's no national campaign in the United States against privatization, yet it seems like the French are actually taking that up.
Yes, of course, like in all countries, like in all labor movements, we have our problems. We do sometimes have issues, of course, with bureaucrats, with some unions that are bureaucratized, and we have our issues as well, of course. But the good thing is that given the legacy of the French workers' movement, especially in the railway and some other industries, we have strong unions, even if they're weaker than they were, for example, 20 or 30 years ago. But we still have functioning unions in the workplace that can make sovereign decisions and that are organized nationally in a federation where we can launch united and unified campaign all across the territory, which means that when we call for a national strike and that this stems from the workforces, this stems from the work floor.
You actually have votes and discussions in the workplace and make decisions locally. How is that possible?
Exactly, that's where I wanted to come to, is that when we go on strike, we make sure that all decisions pertaining to the organization of the strike, be it how we organize the picket line, how we use the strike funds, how we the content even of the leaflets, everything is discussed in a general assembly that is held daily, except during weekends, because then we need to rest because striking can be really tiring, and we vote on everything, and the most important decision on whether to continue or stop the strike is taken by a vote in all depots at 10 a.m. every morning when we are on strike all across the country. There will be a general assembly where we will ask the question, does the strike continue or not? Of course, as a union, we will have a position where we will suggest it to the workers, but in the end, it's the workers and the rank and file that will decide on whether we continue the strike or not. And for example, when we have negotiations with the company, the government, whatever, the results of the negotiations are basically being reported back to all the general assemblies, who will then decide, is this good enough or not good enough for us? That's the most important aspect, is that the rank and file must decide for the conduct of the strike, because they are the ones striking, so only they must make the decisions.
And are you shocked about the decline both of the infrastructure of the United States, collapsing infrastructure, and also the railroad derailments once every couple of days, plus even Boeing, the lack of safety on Boeing? Is this a surprise or shock to you?
It's not a surprise. It's still a shock because of the consequences, of course, because we're talking about people's lives. Of course, not only those working on the railroads, because we have, you see people working on the railroad who are exposed to severe danger, but also for the passengers, also the accidents like the one in Lake Megantic, I forgot the name of it, and East Palestine, not Palestine, East Palestine. Those are like severe accidents that are directly linked to failures of the Class 1 railroads, and those who have paid the consequences are, of course, the railway workers and the communities who have suffered from these massive accidents. And it all boils down to the greed of those who own the railroad, because these accidents are not a fatality. They could have been avoided with proper maintenance procedures and proper staffing. These accidents can't...
It's not rocket science.
Exactly. Yeah. It is a science, but it's not something unattainable. We know how to not make these accidents happen. And what is worrying is that even though we're not at that stage in France, we know that the same causes will lead to the same consequences. And we can already see in France, despite the fact that we have a railway that is, of course, it's not comparable to the state of the US railway, which is really, really at the lowest it can get. But we can see that the same causes are going to lead to the same consequences. And we are already seeing in the French railway, because of the fact that our companies, the company is now trying to basically implement management style that is similar to one in the US or to Great Britain, we are starting to see that these consequences are starting to appear in the French network, and we want to halt that because we know what it's going to lead to. So that's also part of the campaign to raise public awareness around our issue. It's not only about our terms and conditions, which is of course very important. We will never excuse ourselves. We're not ashamed of defending our terms and conditions, but it's not only about that. It's also about public safety issue. It's a public health issue also.
And the governments of the United States, there's going to be a vote this weekend to give maybe $92 billion more for war to Israel, to Ukraine, to Taiwan. Macron, your president, has said that he may send troops to Ukraine. It seems like there's unlimited resources, billions of dollars for war. What does your union and what do working people in France think about these issues?
We as a union who organize the working class, who organize regular working people, we are saying that this war is of no interest to working people, because these are wars that are being fought by competing imperialist powers over issues such as control over natural resources, geopolitical influence, basically interests that are not ours, but yet they are going to ask us not only to fund it through our through our tax money, but also at the end of the day, if they deem it necessary, they're going to ask working class people to fight that war on the ground, boots on the ground, and while they are being kept safely in their bunkers, far away from the front lines. So we are saying these type of wars, they are not our wars, and we're going to do everything in power by any means necessary to halt that dynamic. And we're going to, of course, campaign against this this craziness, this foolishness, because this is going to lead to widespread massacre in which working people from all over the world have nothing to gain. And there used to be a saying in the European socialist movement already during at the eve of the First World War, where Rosa Luxemburg, for example, said that the options that the working class will be faced with will be either barbarism or socialism. And I think that is actually something that is still very actual today, and we can see that where we're headed, we are still faced with the same two options, barbarism or a better future, and it's up to us to prevent that barbarism from happening.
And the genocide now that's going on in Palestine, the struggle of the Palestinian people, it seems like the United States is now complicit with that genocide, with the bombs and rockets and destruction.
Yeah, of course, and more than complicit, because many of these weapons, be it the military aircraft or even the bombs, are provided directly by the United States, but not only by the United States, even though it's, of course, by far the biggest donor and the biggest funder, but even governments in France and Europe, they are supporting the Israeli occupation, they are supporting the massacre and the genocide of the Palestinian people, and they are severely criminalizing all the actions we are taking in support of Palestine. Only this morning, this 18th of April, a leading member of our union, of the CGT in northern France, this comrade is called Jean-Pierre Delescaux, was condemned to 1 year in prison because of the positions of support we took in support of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, and because we just basically reminded that this war, this situation didn't start on the 7th of October. It's the result of 75 years of brutal occupation and colonization and apartheid, and that was deemed as a support of terrorism by the French judiciary system. And but that will not make us bow down, because we know we're on the right side of history, and we have a long history of union members being sentenced to prison, even executed by some governments, but that has never prevented us from standing on the right side of history, and we're really proud of that. So, of course, all my thoughts to my comrade who's condemned to 1 year for your prison, and will continue to stand by this side, on the right side of history.
Another issue that faces workers around the world is the role of the AFLCIO. The AFLCIO was working with the CIA. They were involved in the overthrow of the government of Allende. They've been supporting right-wing unions around the world, and they get $75 million from the National Endowment for Democracy for their Solidarity Center, which has operations in 62 countries. This idea of unions taking money from governments and its role in Europe and France, what do you think about it, and what should American workers do about it?
It has a very nefarious role, and very concrete one. It's not with very practical consequences for the labor movement. For example, in France, where I work and where I live, for historical reasons, the AFL-CIO and the CIA, and this is not some weird conspiracy theory, because the unions I'm going to talk about admit it. They say, yeah, this is our history. For example, in 1947, when the Marshall Plan was implemented, so I'm going back a few decades now, but when the Marshall Plan was implemented and the money from the US poured in Western Europe, two conditions were set forth by the American government, who used the AFL-CIO International Department to further their interests. The two conditions was, the first one was to expel all the communist ministers who were sitting in government just after the Second World War, because the communist parties in Western Europe, most notably France and Italy, were massive and were seen as a threat because of the strength they had. So the two conditions were, you have to expel the communist ministers from the government, and the second one, very important, was to organize splits in the massive unions that were dominated or heavily influenced by the communist movement, such as mine, the CGT, which is the strongest union in France, and even more at that time, where it was even much stronger than it was today. And so, for example, there's a union in France called CGT-FO, so it has the same first three letters as mine, and FO, which means worker struggle, was created by the CIA and by a CIA agent called Irving Brown, if I remember correctly. And So that union was literally created as a splinter union within our CGT to diminish its strength, in order to organize an artificial split within the working class, and in order for basically the governments and the imperialist powers to have a direct agent in the European labor movement. But I'm talking about the European labor movement, but the same mechanism were observed in many countries in Asia, in Africa, and it has had a really nefarious effect. Not only because of the splits in the union, because that can happen for other reasons, but it was really to have this ideology, this perverse ideology of class collaboration, of supporting your own imperialism, of rallying behind your government when it's at the most critical issues. That's what the point of it. So it's a really nefarious role that has been played. It doesn't mean, of course, that all the members of the AFLCIO in the US are agents of the CIA. I'm not saying something ridiculous like that. I'm just alerting on the nefarious role its leadership has had to undermine independent working class organizations. And that role continues to this day. And that is also why we, as trade unions, for example, within the CGT, are many who have decided to rejoin the WFTU in order to have an international trade union movement that can function independently of these shenanigans and defend an independent working class line based solely on the defense of our class interest and no collaboration with imperialist governments.
And it seems like both the Republicans and Democrats have a bipartisan policy. The money from the government, the National Endowment for Democracy, bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans supporting the AFLCIO's international operations. Who are they representing?
Well, not workers, of course. So by asking the question, you've already answered it, because it's not workers they're representing. And if it's a bipartisan issue, because it's on this issue, I know that at least for the show, Republicans and Democrats can pretend to not agree on many issues, but on that issue, they won't even pretend to disagree. That they will be really aligned on. And for a simple reason, is because both parties defend the interest of the U.S. imperialist establishment across the world, and that's their main purpose when it comes to foreign policy. And the trade union movement is seen as a vehicle through which they can further these ideas and interests, because it also shows that they have understood one thing, is that organized labor can be a powerful tool. So if they manage to control it, it means that they control the working class, it means that they control the majority of the population, it means that they can control and further their interest at our expense. So it also shows that organizing as workers is important. They have understood it. That is why they're putting money on making sure they're the one controlling it.
And they're sending $300 million into Mexico to help mold the Mexican unions as well. I mean, an investment to make sure that they're not militant class struggle unions.
But they're basically hoping to have unions that are extensions of the State Department, of the U.S. State Department, some kind of embassy would not be the correct word, but not very far from it. They want antennas within the working class that will further their own agenda and interest. It doesn't mean that they will basically dictate everything that union does, but they will make sure that ideologically and that the people who are who emerge as leaders will be funded and trained by them with the idea and the correct idea that the dog won't bite the hand that feeds them.
And in the United States now, there's growing anti-Chinese efforts, boycotts of China, trying to shut China down, to drive towards a war with China. What do the French workers and what does your union think about this effort to isolate China and militarize and encircle China?
Well, as usual, we will denounce, because even though it's in large part an issue of the US that sees its hegemony across the world threatened by China, because it's pretty much the only power now that can pretend to be a rival in terms of economics, in terms even of military power. So the US sees that a threat. And the European Union, the countries of Europe who are aligned with the US, will of course toe pretty much the same line. They will try to play their own partition, try to play out the differences and the rivalries between them. But at the end of the day, they will of course be aligned with the US for economical and political reasons. And we as a trade union, we will say the same thing I said in the beginning. It's that these rivalries are those of imperialists. These are not our rivalries. We have no enemies within the Chinese workers, and we often work for the same companies as the Chinese workers, given how capitalism is globalized today. And we have no interest whatsoever in isolating them, and it would be also very stupid for us to try to pursue that objective, because given the sheer size of the working class of China, the importance China has in the economical stage, links with the Chinese working class of the most most paramount importance. So we, as a trade union, will never toe that line, that anti-Chinese line. We will never toe a nationalistic, hostile line towards China or any other country for that matter. That is not our subject. We are internationalists, and we organize globally, and all workers across the world, with no exception whatsoever, are our natural allies, and we will treat them as such.
You're in the United States now. Internationalism is growing here. Your struggles of railroad workers are struggles that railroad workers here are going on. What do you think is happening in the United States? And is there a rise of fascism that is a threat to the working class, and not just minorities and immigrants, but the entire working class?
Yes, and we can see that situation all across Europe as well. It's the same in the US and the same in the Europe. We can see that the current economical and political crisis that is leading to this society in many aspects collapsing is leading to a growing anger. And unless organized labor manages to not only regain the lost ground we have gained, but manages to launch a comprehensive global counteroffensive that is able to not only reclaim the ground that we have lost, but also set the groundwork for a future in which all workers can look forward to and hope for, we will still be faced with this either barbarism or a socialism, basically. And it's up to us as a union to organize for that future and set the groundwork for it by presenting clear demands, of course, immediate economical demands, but also a vision of how a society that works in the interest of the many and not the few can be envisioned. And that is the role of the labor movement.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And obviously, this struggle is going to continue, and workers need to unite internationally to be successful.
And in that aspect, I would also like for all organized workers in America to maybe also interest themselves in the international trade union movement. And for example, my union is a member of the World Federation of Trade Unions, which has a long and beautiful history of organizing internationalist solidarity and concrete actions all across the world. And part of the mission I'm on here is, of course, to build links, but also to promote the World Federation of Trade Unions, which has affiliates now in the US, but is seeking to grow. And that is also one of the aspects that it's time for the organized American labor to come back to where it belongs, which is with the class-oriented trade movement all across the world. That is where the home of American workers is.
Well, Mayday, 1886, the fight for the 8-hour day, that was an immigrant international day.
And it's very befitting that we are in Chicago to talk about this here, because Haymarket Square is not far away from here. So in terms of symbolism,
what's happening on Mayday in France?
Well, Mayday historically in France is a day where all workers are called on strike. But over the years, partly because the labor movement managed to impose it, it's become a holiday. But it's a holiday where workers go on massive demonstration to put forth the demands that have not been satisfied, and also to mark the international solidarity all across the world. And so it's a day of demonstration. But sometimes it's also a day of strike. For example, 4 years ago when we were in 2018, it just happened to be that we were on a strike in the railway. So at that point we were on strike. But nowadays it's a massive day of demonstration all across the country where we put forth the demands that have not yet been satisfied, and also mark the international solidarity with workers from all over the world.
Thank you for joining us.